Jen Calloway in the house. So, first of all, sincere thank you for allowing me to step into your space. For those of you that are here on a regular basis, and maybe even a little bit of a home away from home for you if you spend a lot of time here and volunteer and everything that's involved with running a museum and an organization. So thank you for having me here. Also, thank you so much to Ed for lots of emails and phone calls and coordinating the right date and time and things like that, and of course to Jen for being the connector that she is and originally connecting Ed and I. So I really appreciate you having me here this morning. So really my hope is to speak to the things that are interesting to you before I can maybe answer some questions that you may have. I figure if I tell you a little bit about me, then that'll help you know what questions you might have about me or my experience. And I wanted to highlight some of Jen Calloway's work. She's a very talented woman, and she has made a couple videos for me, and this is the first one. It's just 3 minutes long. No. I'll stand over here, actually.
Joining me now is Sarah Plummer. Sarah Plummer, former Marine, my first guest. Sarah Plummer, a recognized author, speaker, and motivational coach, has appeared across the media spectrum. Sarah Plummer.
Oops, sorry. That's so good. Whatever.
Is on a mission to empower those who've experienced trauma or difficult life events to just roll with it. She powerfully inspires, instructs, and equips audiences to roll with any challenges life throws at them.
I feel very mission-oriented and passion-driven to bring even a shred of this healing or help or empowerment to other people. My name is Sarah Plummer. I'm a former Marine Corps captain with 2 deployments to Iraq under my belt as an intelligence officer. Because of what I've learned, both good and bad in the Marines, I do what I do now. I train and I teach others how to be leaders and how to be healthy despite trauma or stress. I empower them with tools to authentically and courageously go from good to great, no matter what might be holding them back or where they are stuck. You ultimately have the power to get beyond victimhood and move beyond just barely surviving to thriving and living a passionate life. For me, Semper, which comes from the Marine Corps motto, Semper Fidelis, means always faithful. For me, it means, yes, to be always be faithful, but to also always be sincere, empathetic, motivated, perseverance, engaged and excited, and resilient. And ultimately, just roll with it. The cornerstone of just rolling with it is effective and efficient self-care. We all have battles. We definitely have our personal and professional battles that many of us wage every day. Something just as simple as being able to breathe kept me alive. Having to focus on your breath, that I feel like is just the key component, as it makes you be present. You can't be reliving the past, and you can't be worrying about the future if you really are tied into the breath and being present. You can choose to align. Give yourself permission to shine. Don't burn yourself out. Take care of yourself. Find the alignment that allows you to shine and thrive. Choose one thing that you can do. I chose the map. What's your map? Where do you feel? Because as you heal, you make space for others to heal. It is a fusion of all these tool sets that I use to help others, and seeing it working here on such a large, amazing, powerful scale. And my hope is to bring that to more people. You're only one choice away from being, so let's shoot for it. The greatest gift that you can give the world is to shine your authentic light bright. As you shine, you inspire others to shine. And when you succeed, you give others permission to succeed. So shine. God bless. Thank you so much.
Jen Calloway's hard work. Thank you. Piecing together lots of different things. But the takeaway from that is that I've always loved helping people or kind of guiding people toward better decisions or healthier decisions. I did that first as a Marine Corps officer, and also on sports teams, being in leadership positions and things like that. But really, for me, my experience in the Marine Corps was kind of that culmination of that experience. But in a way, I'm still doing that now, whether I'm mentoring individuals or organizations. And so I want to share a little story to open up that's not about me, but I'm very proud to say that I served 7 years in our United States Marine Corps. So about 7 years active duty, and a few years doing some reserve stuff, which included a handful of opportunities to represent our country at the Military Olympics, which was like one of the best deals I ever got out of the Marine Corps. It took me to some really interesting places like India and Holland and France and Brazil. So we were actually playing in the Olympic Stadium in Rio. In 2011, we commissioned the stadium that the Olympic athletes use this year, and got to live in the Olympic Village, and we were sort of their guinea pigs. We were the first athletes to kind of go through the village and get the logistical flow of things with the food and the security and all those sort of things. So that was really neat. But now, as I do this work, one, that I've done a lot of work on myself, so it is informed by personal experience. But I sort of felt this obligation and a calling to share it, right? Because if I just do it on myself or work with myself, then I feel like I'm kind of missing the other piece of that sort of makes that mission or that purpose whole for me. And it didn't actually start in the Marine Corps for me. So the story I wanted to share that isn't about me is about Chesty Puller, which I think everybody in this room probably knows who Chesty Puller is. But this iconic Marine Corps general. And there's lots of wonderful stories about Chesty Puller, but one that really speaks to me is the story about him fighting in North Korea, and he's leading the 1st Marine Regiment. And they find themselves completely surrounded at one point. So cut off from resupply, reinforcements, communications. And supposedly one of Chesty's young Marines comes up to him and says, "Sir, this is it. We're surrounded." And Chesty's response is Marine Corps legend. He says, "Surrounded? Good. They can't get away from us now." So I think that sounds a little delusional, but given that the man is the most decorated Marine in U.S. history, I think he could back it up. But that same sense of invincibility and a whole lot of delusion and a little bit of wildness is what I feel like I carried with me as a 19-year-old officer candidate, Air Force officer candidate. So for me, my journey actually started in the Air Force. And that pinpointable kind of tipping point, that transition for me occurred in the summer of 2001. I was at Lackland Air Force Base near San Antonio, Texas, running up the barracks stairwell with a huge duffel bag on my back when my left leg pretty much gave way from underneath me. This moment in time that already at that point in my life I'd been training for years. Is that me doing that? I think so. Sorry. But this moment in time that I've been training for years, it was like everything just suddenly stood still. And before I even knew the full scope of my injury, I knew something had majorly shifted. So I had ripped my hamstring nearly in half on the first day of Air Force ROTC field training. And my world sort of shattered for a moment. Well, and for several days. So for the next few days, I really just grit my teeth and basically dragged my leg behind me for a few days and popped 800 milligram Motrin like they were Pez. Can I get an amen, right? Who's ever taken the horse pill sized Motrins, right? So I was just eating those like candy. It was doing absolutely nothing. And long story short, I ended up leaving field training early. Now this was as I said, kind of shattered my world. It was a shock to my system because my identity was so tied into my success at this training. I'm going to be an Air Force officer, and I'm going to be a pilot, and all these things I thought I was going to do and that very much defined who I thought I was just suddenly changing, right? But at the same time, it was also a wake-up call because it forced me to pause, reassess, and reflect. Because deep down, I didn't want to be in the Air Force. I wanted to be a Marine. So I'd already been making jokes to my parents about becoming a Marine, and I'd call them from college and say, so I went and worked out with the Marines today. So what would you say if I wanted to be a Marine? And my mom's response was, no. What do you mean? That wasn't a yes or no question. I asked you what you thought, and she would just say no. And so I was like the crazy college kid who, when everyone was stumbling home at 4 in the morning, I was getting up at 4 to go throw myself against walls and climb ropes and trees and jump in rivers with all the Marine ROTC midshipmen.
Where are we going to school?
University of Virginia. So down in Charlottesville, Virginia, over on the East Coast. And I was also doing all my Air Force ROTC stuff and playing soccer at school and going to school. So I was a little bit of a crazy person. And like I said, lots of delusion and a little bit of wildness and that sense of invincibility. Well, over time, I was doing more and more training with the Marines. And so when this thing happened in Texas, and another long story short, ended up being a little bit of an out of my Air Force contract to then switch to the Marines. Now, telling your Air Force father that, who was a career man for about 25 years, is not an easy task. And I actually wanted to read an excerpt of a letter from him. I got to pull this up here real quick. That he wrote me as I was going through the transition process from Air Force ROTC to Marine Corps ROTC. Because when I came home from field training and met with my Air Force colonel and the Marine Corps major, they said, yeah, no, you can't do this. You're under contract with the Air Force. You're going to get kicked out of school. We're going to enlist you in the Air Force, and you're going to have to pay back all the money we already spent on you. So for someone wanting to be a Marine Corps officer, that was kind of a worst case scenario in my mind, right? Like, that's not what I want to do. But about 9 months of back and forth between the ROTC units, daily phone calls and letters from my parents, the switch did eventually go through. But in the meantime, I had a lot of resistance, is a nice way to put it, I would say, from my parents. So this letter from my father, kind of during that process, I'll just read an excerpt of it. If I can find it. Apologize, I wasn't at the right spot here.
How many pages are your father's letters?
Well, there are lots. I'm just going to read a short part of one of them. I had it in a different part of my notes here. Okay, so my dad says, I will never say I approve of your decision to join the Marines. And thank God you will never have to fight in a war. This is 1 week before 9/11. Thank God you will never have to fight in a war. But there's death and destruction you'll have to deal with. You can believe all you want that you can make it in the macho world of the Marines, that you can make them accept you, but you will never be a man, and you will never be as mean, nasty, tough, or strong. The Marines are built on that concept for a reason. It doesn't matter what they say to be politically correct. They have to believe that they are meaner, nastier, and tougher than the enemy bastard whose throat they have to slit on a dark night. To his 19-year-old daughter, light reading, no big deal. Decide you can do it. Decide you can convince others to do it. You will have something of an uphill fight in any service because you're a woman, so don't kid yourself. It isn't right, but it's true. Please don't do this. It gets me even reading it today. So, and my dad and I were pretty close. I was the only one of my siblings who went into the military, so I was sort of that one connection of his kids that we could talk about some of the military stuff. And we've since reconciled, but I didn't speak to my parents for a long time after that. And I gotta say, I hear that a lot from Marines. There's this pretty strong, one end of the spectrum or the other, I think, with the Marines in particular of joining. But really even joining the joining the military at all is a major decision and can potentially disrupt, some of our parents, our family members, our friends' impressions of that path. And so I think that's, for me, was kind of one of the initial universal points in my military journey, was that whether it's about joining the military or something else, we've all been in a place where we've disappointed someone we've loved, right? Or we think we're going to disappoint someone we love because of the choices that we make. But I think to live kind of out of alignment basically with who we are at our core can destroy us. Like, I felt so certain that that was the path I was supposed to be on, that it made me sick to think of not being on that path. And so that epiphany, not that I would have called it that at the time, has really informed then my leadership style as I went forward, and definitely the work that I do now and that I've been doing through my businesses the last several years. So we can go to the next slide. So this was me getting ready to leave for my first deployment. As you can see, my mom's not quite holding it together there, and my dad's giving me a stern talking to. And my father and I, like I said, we really reconciled quite well. Once the switch officially went through to go the Marine Corps route, he was nothing but supportive. But for every day for about 6 months, I got a letter, some much harsher than that, telling me I was going to ruin my life, and he would never approve of it, would never tell me he was proud of me.
Scared to death.
Yeah.
Always listen to your father.
Yeah. Well, and so the ironic thing is a lot of what he outlined in some of his letters, like some of these worst case scenarios, actually happened to me. I mean, I had some pretty terrible experiences in the Marine Corps. But the kind of crazy and beautiful thing is, because I felt so certain about that choice aligning with my core values, it was still a decision I could live with. So even when the proverbial crap hit the fan, I almost said a really bad word, I had to censor myself. It was still on kind of a root level something I could live with. Now, my mom, on the other hand, this is, we're getting ready to get on the bus, and they're going to take, this is when I was stationed at 29 Palms, and we bus out to a military airport to then fly us over, through Kuwait and then into Iraq. And my mom says to me before I get on the bus, "One day you'll do something I can be proud of." That was her last words to me before I got on the bus. So she didn't think that women should be in the military at all, but originally when I was in Air Force ROTC, she was like, well, at least it's Air Force. So she was still, even once I became active duty, it was really hard for her for a long time. So, and then we can go to the next slide. And just a couple pictures. Maybe you're wondering what's happening here on the one on the left. So this is one of the staff sergeants I worked with, Staff Sergeant Cornejo, and he's pretending to shine my boots because my relationship with the Marines was very, very sarcastic, very, I would say, not hierarchical. Obviously, being an officer and the difference between officer and enlisted and what we're constantly told to adhere to, obviously, rules and regulations. But I think even an attitude that a lot of the officers adopted was not one that felt right to me, just to kind of speak to that whole aligning with your core values thing. In my experience, especially once I was deployed, I actually saw a lot of officers treat the enlisted Marines like garbage, and it really bothered me. So although it may not be as funny to you guys as it was to us, this was sort of our way of kind of poking fun at that, oh, Staff Sergeant, come shine my boots, and we're pretending, and it's like some huge, broom there because we're sweeping up the dust all the time. And those are just a few of the other Marines that I was with up at Al-Qaim in support of Operation Steel Curtain, up in the northern part of the country a bit. So we were flying Scan Eagle UAVs up there, the unmanned aerial vehicles. So when I was in Al-Assad and Al-Qaim, we were using Scan Eagles, and when I was in Taqadum, we were flying the Pioneer, which there's a picture of on the handout there. But I picked a couple of these pictures. There's so many, from the deployments that just really speak to my memories of that experience. But the things that I really took with me the most wasn't everything I understood about imagery analysis and real-time actionable intelligence and route reconnaissance and artillery adjustment and battle damage assessment, all those things. It was the jokes that we told, right? The movies we watched, the stupid things we said and did, the inappropriate videos that we made of using stuffed animals to reenact battles because we were trying to cope with what we had seen and what we were going through. Those were the things that I really took with me. So we can go to the next slide. Second deployment, again, just kind of picking a couple. This one picture for me just shows that sort of desolate environment there. I'm smiling. My second deployment was quite different for me than my first deployment. and for me, this is sort of a pinpointable moment. I was on my way from Takadam up to Al Asad, and I was miserable on the inside. This was sort of the beginning of what felt like my death, actually. I was quite sick a few months later, was probably about 30 pounds lighter than that, was having a lot of health problems, and sort of my second major epiphany on my second deployment. One of the Marines that I worked with, Staff Sergeant Tatahe, was a little different than the other Marines, I'll say. Which unfortunately got him, ribbed and poked fun of quite a bit. But he was kind of an older, wiser sort of guy, was into yoga and meditation and spiritual things. And when I worked the night shift on the first part of my first deployment, he and I were on both deployments together. We'd, it'd be a little bit quieter in the evening. We'd have time to kind of have some more of these conversations about life and, things he was working on, and he was very willing to share his experience with all the Marines about how much meditation had helped him. So this is 15 years ago. People thought he was a total wackadoodle, and probably there's plenty of people who still think that. But so on the first deployment, he had given me a yoga DVD, and I hadn't really used it very much. I'd practiced yoga very sporadically, but on the second deployment, I still had this yoga DVD. And when I went up to Al Asad, I was quite isolated, whereas like most of my main unit, BMU 1, was at TQ, was in Takadam. And
What year was that?
2005 to 2007.
You were in TQ?
Mm-hmm. Were you there?
Sometimes.
On main side? Because we were over on the back end. No?
No, we were on the back end.
Yeah.
That little weird town hall.
Yeah.
Close to the airstrip?
Yep.
Yeah.
And then when they built the big one, that was like, were you there when the new one came in, that big field between main side and the back side?
I left in 2006.
Okay, yeah, I think they've finished it end of 2006. It was very exciting. It was like a long walk to get to the real chow hall. So, and actually, so we, on our flight line, we just had like our slop buckets, that was like, I think at least a couple days old, the food from before, and you would just, get it. It would be kind of warm if you were lucky, because even over on not the main side of TQ, BMU was even more isolated, kind of over in our little nook of the base. And that's actually, yeah.
How long lasted the deployment?
I did 2 7-month deployments with just a few months home between the two. So, yeah, over there from basically 2005 to 2007 with a few months home in the summer. Yeah. And I was going to, well, that may not be an appropriate story. Okay, I was going to tell a story about it. Okay, well, since we're talking about the chow hall, so on the first deployment, our logistics officer sent an email out to the entire squadron saying for Christmas, we're going to have the officers serve the Marines, because usually the enlisted officer or the enlisted Marines were the ones at the flight line chow hall who would, throw the food onto our plates and whatnot. So he sends this email out to everybody and says, officers, write me back and let me know who wants to do the morning, noon, and evening meals. I hit reply all, I'll do the nooner. Not knowing what nooner meant. And my email immediately started bing, 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 bing. All these emails, I'm like, I don't understand what's happening. And later someone explained to me what nooner means, and that's what our commanding officer called me for the remainder of the deployment. That was my new call sign, was nooner. And I really never lived that one down. But the previous call sign I had was pep rally, because that was sort of my way of coping with things, was just to be really happy and like notice which Marines weren't getting care packages, or which Marines, were kind of down and out. And so even if they weren't in my section, I really was spending a lot of time off my kind of shift hours mentoring Marines from the other sections on a variety of different things, from faith to fitness, depending on what those guys and gals were going through. And so pep rally was like sort of sarcastic at first, because I was, it's the whole like fake the funk, like fake it till you make it. But it really did, it did keep my spirits lifted through most of that deployment. And of course, when you kind of get your mind off yourself, I think that really helps too. So if I was sort of stuck in my internal dialogue, I could go pretty dark pretty fast. But if I was, out interacting with the Marines in my section and other sections, sort of kept me fresh, kept me sharp, thinking about other people, I think. So Nooner was what I got called the rest of that deployment, and on to the next one. And then I acquired a couple other nicknames. We don't have enough time for all those stories. But so on the second deployment, that's kind of one of the last pictures I have of me smiling for the next 6 months. And so I revisited this yoga DVD because when I was up in Al Asad, I had my own room, a can, so these teeny tiny trailers that you could live in. And because I was the only woman in my unit, I got my own space. And I went back to this DVD that Staff Sergeant Tatahe had given me, and it just became such an anchor point for me that kind of in that intro video, if you recall, I mentioned the breath, like kind of said, if I could just breathe, then that was an anchor point for me. Because on that deployment, it got to the point where one morning specifically, I remember opening my eyes, and I wouldn't say I awoke because I never really slept. Maybe I fell asleep for an hour or so here and there, but opened my eyes in the morning, and the first thing I saw was my pistol. Just a standard Marine Corps issue M9 pistol. Hanging in my brown leather holster that my ex-boyfriend had given me, because those are the kind of gifts you give a loved one when you're in the Marine Corps. And I saw that, and I saw my yoga mat rolled up at the foot of my bed between it and my wall locker. And this can I was in was just big enough for a single bed, a wall locker, and the space on the floor to roll out a yoga mat. And I had a choice, the pistol or the yoga mat. It was life or death for me at that point.
So which one did you choose?
Yoga, always the yoga. Yeah.
Were you in the Marines too?
Yeah. Heckling people during very personal, dark stories. I feel right at home. No. But to have that choice, to make that choice, to then for many mornings after that particular morning, to just roll off my bed onto my yoga mat. When I tell you what, I knew nothing else at that point in my life. I mean, I just felt completely drained. As I said, I was very sick, dealing with a lot of different things. There was really at that point in my life not one area of my life untouched by trauma or drama. And so for me, that just being able to breathe, that meant that I was still alive, was enough to just keep me going through the end of that deployment. But again, that was something I came back to later when I got out of the Marines and started figuring out what kind of work I wanted to do. And it's really been a key component of my health and honestly my survival to this day. So that's the second deployment. I think we can go to the next slide. So I did mention having the opportunity to represent our country in the military Olympics on a handful of occasions. So this picture here, this is in India, and that's what you can see behind us is just part of what is like the Great Wall, equivalent of like the Great Wall of China in India. It's this massive, massive fort. And so we were playing soccer, but we were there with over 100 countries, over 6,000 athletes, over 40 sports represented, and they always made a point of making sure that we had a cultural component to the trip. So we spent a couple weeks in India, and they took us up to the fort, and they took us a couple other places and things like that. And then this picture on the left, that's me standing with some Irish soldiers, and I mentioned the connections, you know, the friendships, the camaraderie with my Marines being one of my just most cherished takeaways from my time in service. The other thing is I also got to meet people from all over the world. So the girl on the far left, the woman there, her name's Jillian. And a couple of years after this picture, this is all of us actually in Canada. So we were at a basically women's sports summit that was being hosted in Kingston, Canada at their military academy there. And again, we got to meet people from all over the world. There were women from Jordan, from Iran, from China, places that were even countries that we probably don't normally, hang out with North Koreans, right? But they would send basically delegations to these different events. With the military Olympics, just as a side note, if North Korea came, South Korea wouldn't, and if South Korea came, North Korea wouldn't. So it was kind of every other year the different Koreas would come. But a couple years later, I went to Ireland and visited Jillian and went to her farm in the middle of nowhere, Ireland, during lambing season and helped birth lambs on her farm. And who'da thunk? Like a couple years later, right? So that was when I was still active duty. And then next slide. So as I mentioned, yoga. This young man, Tyler, actually lives in this area here, the one with the USMC tattoo on his arm. Kind of how Jen and I found one another, the interwebs. You gotta love the internet these days. It's a blessing and a curse, but it really does help us connect to one another, and that is sort of how Jen and I found one another as well. She was trying to connect to other female vets and get people involved, and she invited me to an event that Marcus Luttrell was speaking. That was what, 4 years ago? 3? Something like that. Anyway, and so Tyler found me in a somewhat similar way. He had heard lots of things about yoga helping veterans with post-traumatic stress, with anxiety, with depression, with a variety of health issues. And like any good Marine, he was quite skeptical, as I once was too, where I was like, this is the weirdest stuff ever, until, and actually when Staff Sergeant Tatahe gave me the first time he gave me the DVD, he kind of put it in his hands like this, and he was like, ma'am, you need this. Which I was like, all right, I'm gonna pay attention to that. You got to listen to your staff NCOs, right? So he knew what he was talking about. And so anyway, Tyler did a search for free veteran yoga in the Denver area and found me and started coming to some of the classes that I was teaching. And then these two pictures, and then Caitlin here is actually a Navy veteran. And this is a retreat I held in Costa Rica back in 2014, but I do these every year. And those retreats aren't necessarily veteran specific, but obviously we still have veterans come who want to check this stuff out and kind of take a deeper dive. So next slide. And VFW Post 1 on Santa Fe and 8th down in Denver. These are the classes we've been teaching. So I started the yoga program there about just over 2 years ago, July of 2014. And it has now grown. What was originally me just kind of showing up whenever I could and letting people know the day of, hey, I'm teaching yoga at the Post, come on down if you can. We now have the support of Comeback Yoga, Team Red, White, and Blue, Team Rubicon, the mission continues, and we now have classes every Tuesday and Thursday at 7 p.m. It's free to veterans, family members, community members. So we have local business owners that are in some of the spaces near the VFW who sometimes come as well. And we have everyone from ages 9 to 90, and people who've never done yoga and people who do it all the time. And a couple of my favorite stories from doing this now for a couple of years. One was a young man who came in, and usually if everyone seems sort of comfortable and we have some time, I'll ask everyone to sort of introduce themselves, just a basic, like, what's your name, if you were in the service, what branch. And if you want to mention it, why you're here or why you like yoga or why you do yoga or whatever. And a young Marine comes to him and he introduces himself and he says, I'm not here for the yoga. I'm here to get the hell out of my apartment. Great, come. You don't have to do the yoga. You can come sit. But and that, speaking again to those social connections, like how vital that really is and how much that impacts our well-being on all levels. And this guy just hit it on the head, and I can sit here and spout research at you for hours about the health predictors and outcomes and yada 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 of resilience and social connection and self-care and all these things. This guy just got it intuitively and was like, I'm here to just hang out with some other people and get out of my apartment, stop isolating. My second favorite story is about also a Marine veteran. We've got a lot of Marines that come to the yoga class at VFW. Alan, who's a Vietnam vet, has, I believe, a hip replacement and then maybe also a knee replacement. And comes in his blue jeans and button-down shirt. Comes every Tuesday and Thursday, has been coming for about 5 months now, and comes in and takes his button-down shirt off and puts it on the chair and does his yoga in his jeans and undershirt, and could barely walk when he first came in. And about a month ago shared with me that he said, I can now shower without needing to hold on to something, without needing support. he's like, I feel, I don't know what's going on, but I feel younger in my head. Like, he was like explaining how much more clearly he thinks now. And I mean, this is like unsolicited. He's just sharing, you know, I'm not like, all right, everyone, tell me what you're getting out of this class. You know, he's just saying this has been amazing, just coming twice a week. You know, and it's, I'm really not here to like promote yoga as like the end all be all best thing ever, although that is what I think. But just to say it's an example, right? It's an example of a way to stay connected, even if that's not initially what you're interested in. And that too is another huge component of the work that I do now, and just kind of encouraging people to find those ways to authentically stay connected and stay supported. So next slide. And now, and if it's okay with you guys, we show another video of Jen Calloway. I've been talking at you for a while. So this is from this March. Yeah, I think if you click the picture on the left, it'll come up. And I won't explain too much more because I think the video will do it for me. Yeah. Jen Calloway in the house.
I came back to Afghanistan. I spent 7 years in what I call the dark place, because all it was anger and depression.
Not until I got home, and I was very angry, very, very angry. And I was crying, like, no reason.
When I got out, I started going through divorce, and life was skyrocketing.
The Resilient Leadership Retreat is intended for military veterans who are interested in bringing their best selves to each and every day. This Resilient Leadership Retreat is all about trying to boil down this big concept of resilience and teaching it through self-care practices, building social support, and cultivating spiritual practices. We learned some specific self-care techniques, so how do I treat my body well, how do I understand my stress, and then we spent some time on spiritual practice and asking ourselves a few questions about how we're doing things and what we're giving time and focus to.
I don't think that's something. There's people who worship me with that. But that's not going on.
Families, very supportive, your choice, and you know, and everything like that. So they encourage you to give time. You have to have a breakdown and a breakthrough. Okay, so that's what happened to me.
I didn't want to feel weak, I guess. I thought I was being tough by like holding it all in and not going to talk to anybody, but that in itself.
We all need help, and that we all need that support. And even when we know things, we need the reminders, we need the encouragement to tweak our path as we go. So over the course of 3 days together, we really worked on understanding the importance of social support, figuring out how to cultivate that healthy tribe.
I had to do a little bit to put my guard down. The best I did was say, having family, the thing about this environment is no matter what you're going through, there's somebody somewhere here who's gone through the same thing. It's just like, wow, I'm not going through this alone. And that's just 4 sessions of yoga now, and I leave it feeling helpless, feeling peaceful. And feeling fantastic. One of the pieces that I put in was about self-defense, and I don't speak expressly, so that's the kind of when you have something like this, it's giving us the tools where we can fix things before it becomes a problem. I kind of compare it to preventive medicine to like surgery. This is like that preventive medicine.
I can absolutely say that it does resonate. It is useful for prevention in multiple populations, all over the country.
It's definitely brought my old self back, and it helps me be able to reach out to other people or try new things or just increase my fears and find my identity.
I need a better understanding. I need an internal comfortability that I don't have. We have been through that. And we need whatever happens. I'm 26 years old, and I know several other guys who've done programs like this, and a lot of them are very helpful in their life, and it's very beneficial altogether.
I just feel so fortunate and so grateful to be a part of this where specific people show up fully while they're here, and if they take a pause in their regular lives to take 3 days to do something like this and invest in themselves, knowing that it's helping them invest in their relationships, in their leadership, in their resilience, it's just a lot to get to them. All right. If a business owner, business will run this, I always say never say no to yourself. So say yes to it. Why not? What do you have to do?
So not to make this a Jen Calloway show, a Sarah Plummer Taylor Jen Calloway show, but just final speaking point to that, I guess, and why I did actually want to share those videos, because one of the things I can't even describe how grateful I am for now our connections, like with someone like Jen, who's just this like stellar human being that we probably wouldn't have met had we not both served. Like, how, maybe we would have bumped into each other, but that, we seek each other out because of that commonality, that shared experience. And from there, like, we're all human. We don't like everybody we meet, but if we do, it's just like extra special to have that connection. And then also that, she's doing so much work that does support better known businesses like the ones I run, that I can turn to someone like Jen who has a similar work ethic, can speak the same language in a lot of ways. It's so much easier to work with Jen than it has been with a lot of other people that I've worked with. And then likewise, a mutual friend of ours, a woman named Lydia Davey, who's also a Marine veteran, runs a PR company and does different things. She also did a lot of work to help us get ready for those resilient leadership retreats. And I guess I just want to make a point of saying I feel like those friendships are sort of extra special. And I don't think we'd have them, had we not had those experiences in the Marines and in the military. So that's probably a good place to stop. I added a few other things to pin on how our time went, but I think the only thing I didn't mention as far as background is that after my deployments, my last assignment on active duty was as the Deputy Director of Geospatial Intelligence at the Marine Corps Intelligence Activity. So sort of going from the soda straw view on the battlefield with UAVs to 100,000 foot view of all geospatial intelligence and imagery that we have available at a national and international level, running a directorate of 120 Marines as a frocked captain. And that was an experience if ever there was one as well. So I was younger than every other Marine that I worked with, and they had run out every previous OIC and brought me in, and that was a little bit scary at first, but it actually worked out really well. And the Staff Sergeant Tatahe, who I mentioned earlier, was actually at that unit too. So there were just a couple Marines like that I spent most of my career with and got to go from unit to unit with, which again just made it extra special. And so by the time I left the Marines in 2009, I really did feel like it was sort of on my terms. I'd mentioned that second deployment being really, really difficult. When I came home, my initial enlistment was up. I could have left active duty in 2009, but I chose to stay in another couple years against, again, the advice of my parents and pretty much everyone I knew who said, get out, get out, get out. Why would you stay in? I stayed in for another couple of years, and really that was one of the best decisions I ever made too. It was when I got out in 2009. It was a much healthier place, a much kind of, sort of full circle experience to have been working at MCIA and do that work and kind of reconnect with the Marines and the stuff that I love. So
Why didn't you make that decision?
Why did I? Because I felt like, I feel like I've gotten this advice before, like, don't make big decisions when you're in a bad place, like whether you're sad or you're stressed, like at an extreme, because you're not, very bluntly, you're not thinking clearly, right? And so I felt like when I got home from that second deployment, I mean, I was messed up. I was in a bad place for a long time. But I don't know, had enough of the intuition or whatever you want to call it to say this wouldn't be, I still had a sense of that there was more work for me to do in the Marines before I got out. As bad as I felt at the time, I still had just such a deep love and appreciation for the Marine Corps that I didn't want to get out hating it. I wanted to stay in and give it another couple of years, keep serving. And actually, so there was that personal piece of it, but also in a concrete sense, it was because I was by name requested by the colonel who was the director at the time at the Geospatial Intelligence Directorate at NCIA. I created an IED tracker when I was in Iraq that no one had really, because I'm a total like organizational nerd, we had all this imagery and all these grid coordinates and it was all sort of like combobulated and mixed up. And I was like, why isn't anyone just like basically hyperlinking every place we've hit an IED, every place we've dropped bombs, every place that we've gone in and gathered imagery and it's connected to the battle space in some way. Let's connect all of that in an organized manner. And so this imagery IED tracker thing I created was actually passed all the way up to the multinational level. And so one of the colonels who was there in Iraq, apparently someone actually gave me credit for it and used my name and said Sarah Plummer created this thing. And so a few years later, he said, hey, I heard about that thing you did in Iraq and we need someone like that here. So if we personally pull you out here, because they sort of knew I was like maybe going to get out, maybe going to stay in, he asked me to come work for him. And I said, all right, I'll do that. So having good leadership, you know, so that colonel pulled me in, really did sort of take me under his wing and not took me under his wing like coddled me, but was like, hey, let's get you back on track. You're a good Marine. You know, let's get you back to work and doing what you love doing and working with the Marines. So, yeah, having strong leaders was huge. That's a great question.
So your mom proud of you now?
An interesting relationship with my mother. Yeah, she is. She is. I mean, you know, now the way she talks about it, like when I hear her, you know, sort of explain things to her friends and stuff like that, it's a much softer version of explaining that I was in the Marines and that I was an intel officer. You know, I think she sort of gets some elements of it a little bit more now. Again, as things have continued to sort of come full circle and pulling in some of those experiences to what I do now, I think she's proud of me. I hope.
Sarah, based on your experiences in the service, you know, and the fact that we're going to continue to have probably a volunteer military for a long time, you have good and bad experiences. And what you see in the news constantly is, you know, younger veterans as they come back, you know, are suffering from depression, PTSD, health issues. What do you advise a young high school student or someone coming out who shows an interest in military? Because obviously your parents, my parents were against it.
Yeah,
I jumped.
it's a lot of that, isn't there?
You know, what do you say to someone?
Well, you know, I think joining at a young age is tricky. We're not fully formed humans yet, that's for sure, right? And I think depending on what the reasons are, you know, I feel like though I've also met some, you know, 17, 18, 19-year-olds who were like wise beyond their years, right, and kind of old souls and had that clearer view. I think in that regard, it depends on the person and what their specific situations may be. If it's just to kind of get out of a bad situation, you know, like, oh, I don't know what else to do, I'll join the military, I would maybe advise them to think a little bit more through that. But, you know, for people who I think have that drive to be challenged, but also be really well supported, the military is a great option. It is also a great place to kind of grow up, right, in a different way than you would if you went straight to college or you went straight to work. In a lot of ways, it's hard, and this is just my 2 cents, I think as hard as the military is, it's also somewhat easier in some ways because things are so, you know, sort of, you know, we get roadmaps to things, we get the support, there's installation, and just, I mean, like, really just the nuts and bolts of it, the support there. I think especially nowadays with all the programming that's integrated into the military. Now that being said, we're still falling way short. We're doing this like after the fact, now looking at, mostly our OIF, OEF vets, and fortunately, or, depending on your experience, that impacting, I think, the Vietnam vets and being able to get more care than they were before because of what's happening with the current generation. Pluses and minuses to that, right? But I think instead of like trying to stop the bleeding after the fact, we just need to do so much more on the front end. And so to someone young wanting to join, that this resiliency programming, let's say, I'm not saying ours specifically, but in general, the principle of resilience can be trained proactively. It's a skills-based thing. It's not like you have it or you don't have it. It's the same way we address leadership in the military. We're constantly getting leadership training. Although there are some people who seem naturally more inclined to it, for sure, that doesn't prevent the military from training people in it. Why can't we have that same attitude about resilience and being proactive about mental well-being and physical well-being, not just from fitness? So if a young person wanted to join, I would encourage them to take the initiative to maybe learn some of those things on their own first. What are the ways that they can self-regulate, whether that's meditation or some other form of mindfulness that just allows that person, I think, to have, that ability to self-regulate, a little bit more empowering versus getting thrown into that fire and not really having any tools to deal with it healthfully.
I have to step out, but I want to know that I love you. And also, what's your favorite little thing that you know about
Good jokes.
it? Like what?
We have some young people in the audience. Thanks, Jen. See you later. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, it's impressive, all this movement of veterans helping other veterans for a massive need of help. I was thinking about some other categories of populations who might need similar help. I was thinking about people who experience mass shootings, who are not veterans, and who do not benefit from a wide network of similarly military experienced people used to organize themselves. So I was wondering if your movement could not help those people who are in tiny numbers but still need a very similar.
Absolutely. So, well, and there's a couple different ways to address that. I think one is, from a research perspective, the peer-led model is empirically validated. It works. This isn't just anecdotal, whether it's in addiction centers, right? Whether it's with veterans, whether it's with people who've experienced something that with such a specificity feels personal to that group, right? That the evidence is so compelling there to work that way. I think veterans are maybe the most well-seen group doing that now, and I think can lead that charge toward just continuing to say, that sort of wounded healer is kind of one, like someone who's already been through it, giving back again and being in that community together. If I'm understanding your question correctly, I think that the veteran group can serve as a model to encourage other groups to keep doing that.
That's exactly the concern I had behind my question. Is the perception I have from a group of veterans, and recently we were in the United States, and what I hear on the radio is more that veterans are requesting some help from the nation. But there, you prove that veterans can also be a help for other nations' need, and rather than being perceived as someone who asks for help, veterans as a group could be perceived as someone who offer help to the nation.
Yeah, and that's a much more empowering model, right, than being just recipients of the help, but actually still being recipients. I still go to counseling. I still practice yoga. I still am a student and a patient, although the patient identity is not one veterans like. I don't think it's one most people like. So I think finding a way, speaking to your question too, of like making this more empowering and more peer-led and more supportive versus like training more than treatment. And that's why I was saying what I did about resilience, in that it's teachable, it's trainable, it's learnable, it's practicable. That's very different than saying go to therapy, go to therapy, go to therapy. Okay, how about go to a class? It just feels a little different. Now that's not going to float everybody's boat, but I think that is a paradigm shift to say, let's start doing more training versus treatment. And gosh, there was something else you said that made me think. I lost it. It'll come back. Where did you come from?
France.
France. What part?
Maybe, anyway.
Yeah, all over. One of our military Olympics was in Cherbourg. I don't know if I'm saying. Yeah, up north.
This is where I met my wife.
Yeah, it's pretty up there. Well, it was a little cold, depending on the day. It was very nice or very cold and windy, but we got to go to Normandy and everything while we were up there. That was and the Saint Michel's. Yeah.
Most beautiful place on earth.
It's gorgeous.
So,
Yeah.
you don't say so yourself.
Any other questions?
So before we go, I want to thank you all for coming, and it's a great pleasure. And I want to present to Sarah one of our Museum Challenge coins for being here. Thank you.
Thank you
very
so
much.
much.
I appreciate
Thank
it
you.
very much. So. So, any other questions?
What about the book? Let's talk about the book.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So I brought some copies of my book called Just Roll With It. If you didn't catch on to that already, I feel like I kind of beat that saying into the ground. Just Roll With It, 7 battle-tested truths for building a resilient life. So I break it down into 7 core character traits that are based on my personal experience, as well as a lot of the research out there that shows what are sort of these commonalities between resilient people from lots of different backgrounds, not just veterans, but those who are resilient, happy and healthy and successful by the ways that we define that. And so at the end of each chapter too, there are some kind of journaling or thought-provoking type questions, and then also some suggested meditations and mindfulness practices if you want to check into those out. So that's the book. There's more coming. This is the first one. Forgive its many imperfections. There are many. But yeah, I wanted to work to get it out there and share a little bit with the community. So.
How much?
They are 20. But I would be happy to give out a handful of copies, just to thank you guys for, like I said, for letting me come into your space and your world, your day this weekend. And I can give you like 5 copies if you want to pick a few people to give them to. And other than that, if you want more copies or want to buy one, I have more up here.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. That'd be wonderful.
5.
I appreciate
Yeah.
that very much. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.